This is Elmhurst, our community. I'm Ken Bartels, your host, and we're coming to you from the business zone at the Community Bank of Elmhurst. Mayor Steve Morley has decided not to run for a third term in this coming April's elections. So we thought it was a good idea if we sat down with him and just got some ideas and thoughts from him about his 8 years as mayor, 14 years as a servant of the city. So I am very pleased to welcome Mayor Steve Morley to the EOC.
Thank you, Ken. Glad to be here.
Steve, the question that I know you must be getting daily, probably, as you encounter people, okay, why aren't you running for a third term as mayor?
You're right, and it really has started this year, February. Started with the state of the city, and I think John Quigley mentioned it in his speech, sure. And that's really when, I don't know if whoever was in the community was started to pay attention to that. So I've been asked that question a lot. And you mentioned in your opening, I've been doing this 14 years, 6 as an alderman, and this will be, come May, it's 8 as mayor. And that's a long time. And it's time for someone else to jump in and see what they can offer. I think that all the aldermen and the elected officials I've worked with, I think we've done a great job along with staff. And I'm looking forward to kind of the next chapter in my life, but I'm also looking forward to stepping back and watching it as an audience member versus a participant.
I think in fairness, if you go back and look at mayoral tenures, if you will, with the obvious exception of Mayor Marcucci, who did 4 terms, 2 terms is about what most of the mayors have served, some fewer, really nobody really that much longer other than Mayor Marcucci. So I mean, but I think people have gotten used to knowing who the mayor is and not having to even kind of think about it. Well, of course the mayor is Mayor Morley, or the mayor is, But, so I've got the answer to that question, but I want to backtrack all the way. I want to go back 14 years, and what was it that caused you to decide to run for alderman and then mayor?
Sure. What's interesting is you mentioned people get used to the mayor. And I had the same experience. Right about the time I was paying attention to local politics, right about the time I was going to college, Ab Gannett was our mayor. Ab Gannett was always our mayor, and it kind of felt that way. And then when I came back from college, married, had kids, and I'm living in Elmhurst, and Tom Marcucci's the mayor. Tom's the mayor. I've always been interested and intrigued by politics. And what intrigued me the most about it was learning the other side, what I'll call the other side, if we're talking about national politics. Because if an issue comes out in general, I know where I stand. But there's always at least 2 sides to every story. And believe me, once you become an elected official, there's 10 sides to every story. But I was always fascinated by political conversations because I couldn't get to necessarily that point of view without a little bit of education from friends. One of my very good friends was an endocrinologist at Northwestern, and we couldn't have been more opposite in terms of our political spectrum, but always enjoyed talking to him. So I kind of had the gift of gab, if you will, and the interest in learning. And I'm a guy who writes a lot of goals down, always writing my goal list. I'll never forget, there's a great story about Lou Holtz had gotten fired. This was 40, 50 years ago. He gotten fired, and he wasn't sure what to do. And he went into his room and he wrote down 100 goals, and he came out to his wife. And he says, "Honey, look, I've got all these goals. What do you think?" And she reviews him and she goes, "You forgot one." He goes, "What?" She goes, "Get a job."
Get a job.
So I'm like that though. I'm always writing down my goals. And about 15, 16 years ago, my wife was having a health scare. She's healthy now, she's great, but it was really pretty difficult for us back then. And in the middle of this, I give her credit, in the middle of this just trying time that we're having, we've kind of embraced the life's kind of short mantra. You got to do what you want to do. And she turns to me one day and she says, "You should run for alderman. I know it's on your list." I kind of, chuckled, and I pulled out my list, and sure enough, it was there. And it even said run for alderman. It didn't say become alderman or become mayor. And it said run for alderman. So that was part of it. You know, that gave me that little push. And then I think a lot of people know, but my stepfather was Gene Hoffman. Gene was a representative for 28 years, maybe, something like that. And I was kind of casual friends with Tom Marcucci. So those guys were, in essence, kind of my political mentors. I liked the way they handled themselves. They always seemed to be pretty happy and willing to help. So wrap all that up, and 15 years ago, I threw my hat in the ring, and it's been great. It's been about a wonderful run.
So, public service in and of itself, what are the personal joys for you that come out of your public service?
Well, it sounds trite to say I like helping people, but what's interesting is we have a wonderful town, a fantastic town. I don't have to tell you that. And there's a certain percentage of the population that just goes about their day. And they know they live in a great town, and that's all they want to know, is that they live in a great town, and they enjoy the town, but they don't necessarily want to know the inner workings or a peek behind the curtain. And I necessarily didn't know what I was signing up for when I ran, but once you get there's 300 people working full-time, not to mention all the boards and commissions. I'm just talking about city staff that works full-time, day and night, to make sure this city runs well. And not only did I get a peek behind the curtain how that works, but then the thing that's interesting about Elmhurst is we've got 7 wards, 14 aldermen. That's a lot of elected officials in a town our size. City of Chicago has 50. West Chicago has 14. Elmhurst has 14. Everybody else in the entire state has an odd number, 7, 5, something like that. So we have a lot of people who are elected. But that makes for what I call neighborhood politics. It's a great way for the elected officials to connect with their neighbors. So if you have an issue, there's a good chance you know your alderman, there's 2 of them in your ward, or your neighbor knows your alderman. And that's what I like about public service, is it's really just connecting people with the right information or the right resource. I don't want to say it's not difficult, because there's conflicts you have to deal with, but you have terrific people in town, and when they have a problem, you know you have a resource to help them. It's just great when you can connect it like that.
I've always been impressed with the, if you will, the learning curve. You and I were talking off camera that many people in Elmhurst might not be aware that the mayor is not a full-time job. It's not how you make your living. It's an avocation. And of course, the aldermen obviously fall into the same category. And yet, the learning curve and the expectations of what you're supposed to know and be on top of are no different than if it wasn't a full-time job. How do you make that work?
You know, one of the things that I think all elected officials have had to deal with in the last 20, 25 years is the internet and smartphones. People ask me, how many hours do you spend being mayor a week? And you mentioned it's not my full-time job by any stretch. Certainly 2020, it was my full-time job, if you want to know the truth. But we're so connected, almost hyper-connected, that if there's a problem, my phone bings, and it's 1 in the morning, or it's 11 at night, or it's 10:30, I might be in a meeting. So you have access to it, you have access to the information. But just because you have access to information, there's actually more information to be had with all of our technology. It's a big learning curve. The best thing you can do is pay attention, and the best elected officials I've found are the ones who are passionate about helping people and about their town. We've got some new aldermen. We've got, in 2020, I had a unique situation where 3 aldermen resigned. In fact, all 3 of them moved out of town, moved out of state. 2 retired, 1 got a new job, and I had to replace them with people. And it's interesting, I remember the position that these new aldermen are in, that I was in 14 years ago, learning. And if you're passionate about it, you kind of soak it up. It's like going back to school. And that's the other thing I tell new aldermen. If somebody asks you a question you don't know, don't guess. You're just going to get in trouble. Say, I don't know, but I'll find out. And either call city staff or call a fellow alderman and get that information. And it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. I was very fortunate when I first got on the council. I was low man on the totem pole completely, 14 out of 14. I was the fourth person on the finance committee, but in call it a unique twist of fate, the fourth person on the finance committee sits next to the chairman of zoning and planning, DP&Z, Development, Planning and Zoning. Happened to be Susan Rose. And talk about getting an education. She is a wonderful person. She's dedicated to the city of Elmhurst. She's the chairman of our Zoning and Planning Commission now, and I can't think of anybody better qualified. But for the first 2 years I was on the council, I sat next to her and talk about an education. It was just wonderful, and you learn. And what's interesting is a lot of the aldermen in Elmhurst, in their wards, will have individual ward meetings. They'll send out flyers, say, hey, 5th Ward, we're meeting at the Knights of Columbus, or 1st Ward, we're going to meet at the library. And inevitably, almost without fail, any of the newer elected aldermen, either appointed or new aldermen, will come to me. And they're, the aldermen are usually nice. They'll say something like, hey, do you mind stopping by? I'm like, yeah. I said, I'll sit in the back of the room. This is your meeting. I don't want to, but if you want me there as a resource, I'm happy to be there. And sometimes I show up. But the new aldermen are always very nervous. What if somebody asks me a question I don't know? How am I going to handle it? I said, well, first of all, there's going to be a lot of people there. You've got your fellow alderman who more often than not has more experience than you, but there's usually a city staff person there or not. And I said, the other thing with these new aldermen, I said, that you're not going to realize until you get into that meeting is how much you actually know. You've been doing it for 6 months. You've been to every meeting on a Monday night for the last 6 months. You've been on Zoom calls, you've done this, you've done that, and you're absorbing a lot of times what you don't realize. And it shows, it really does. I mean, you just kind of, you learn as you go, and as I said, if you're passionate about it, then you learn even quicker.
Share just for a moment the notion of the quote-unquote weak mayor, strong city manager form of government. How does that
So that's a
play
great
into
question.
this?
A lot of people don't realize that. So I think we have either 5 or 6 different municipal structures in the state of Illinois. And the one that's most prevalent is a weak mayor system, which is what we have, where we hire a professional CEO, if you will. Jim Grabowski, he's our city manager. He's the professional CEO. And he runs the city day to day. We're a $120 million corporation, if you want to look at it in that sense. So the citizens of Elmhurst would be shortchanged if it was just me running the city. I don't have the amount of time that Jim does. We hire him full time. But there is definitely a unique relationship between the city manager and the elected officials. The elected officials are really the eyes and ears of the people. They're the ones who, if something's happening out in the city, they bring it into City Hall, and City Hall figures out how to work with it. It's a great check and balance. When I first got elected, I sat down with Jim Grabowski. This was, 8 years ago. I don't have to think that hard. It was 8 years ago. And, Jim had worked for Pete DeCiani or worked with Pete DeCiani and Scott Levin in the interim. And we sat down, we kind of had a conversation, and I knew Jim well, but not as well as I certainly do now. And we talked about, hey, how do you want to handle things? And we came to an agreement. He will handle the personnel, and I will handle the politics. And what I mean by that is, okay, if there's a problem in public works and there's an opening because somebody retired, it's not up to me to sit with Jim and try to interview the assistant manager of the public works garage or something of that nature. But on the flip side, when it comes to stuff that's bubbling up from a political standpoint, whether it's residents in town are flooding, or they want a certain type of building built, or they don't want a certain type of building built. I kind of weigh and measure and help that process along, and then staff and elected officials meet and merge and try to come to some sort of an agreement. If you look at the org chart that we have at City Hall, it's got the city manager, then it's got the department heads, and it kind of trickles all the way down. But then uniquely so, if you look above the city manager, there's the mayor, there's the city council, and then above all of those people are the residents of Elmhurst. And that's really how it works. It's kind of a reverse funnel. And it works very well. It really does. You know, you mentioned the city manager type of government. We're fortunate to have Jim Grabowski. I think he's not only the best in DuPage County, but the best in the state of Illinois. And we're fortunate to have him. And it's been my pleasure to work with him for the past 8 years.
So I know you well enough that you're a team-oriented type of individual. I mean, you're mayor and you've got aldermen and you've got staff, and it's a team effort in terms of the success of the city. But at the same time, you are the mayor and you are not standing for re-election. So here's an opportunity to the most significant or the key accomplishments or even the general areas of key accomplishments during your time as the mayor of Elmhurst.
You know, people would, as I've been through 8 years now, some people would come up and say, hey, you're doing a great job, or you're doing this, or you're doing that. And I was always very quick to say, as you mentioned, you know, it is a team effort. I say at every speech I give, it really is a team effort because it's true. And then I also will say, you know what, I'll talk about that in 8 years, right? I'll point and talk about it in 8 years. But we're close enough, Ken, so I'll try to answer your question. As we all know, actually, between the time I was elected in April and the time that I was sworn in May, we had a major flood of that year. Now, I joke that at the time, you know, Mayor Levin was the mayor, and he created a real problem for us. And then I had to get sworn in, and I had to deal with flooding. But that's really probably, there's two things I would point to that happened, or that I'll say we accomplished in the last 8 years. One is the stormwater mitigation that we have done in the city. We had 0 projects done, 0 projects even on the books 8 years ago. And I think we've got 12 completed and 2 more in planning, actually in engineering. So we'll have 14 that can take on water before the end of this summer. And if you look at, and it's just, we had the resources, we had the time, we had the people, and I remember at the very beginning, there was a number thrown out there. It was 121 acre feet. An acre foot is, give or take, 325,000 gallons. 1 acre foot. And during a 100-year event, we have a 121 acre foot problem. It's a lot of water. And I remember we hired engineers, and we're looking at this stuff, and it's just monumental. This just massive goal we have to try to hit. And I always, you know, I hearken back. Tom Marcucci's a friend, and he always used to say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Well, that's what we've been doing for 8 years. I've been fortunate. Jim Kennedy is the chairman of Public Works, and all the aldermen who've worked on it, and certainly all city staff who've worked on it. We have really done a whole lot in terms of stormwater. If you look at, I remember at the very beginning of this, we did a stormwater, and I think it even started under Mayor Pete. We did a stormwater task force and did some topographical reviews and all this kind of stuff. And we had this finished map of where it floods in Elmhurst and how much inches of rain we get and what the map looks like. And I can't remember who found it. Might have been Pete Pyatt, or at the time Brian Berghager or somebody. Somebody pulled out a map from 1956 and laid it on the table. And it showed flooding in Elmhurst in 1956. And we took that map from 2000, probably around 2010, and we laid it. And I mean, it was, you could have traced it. So this problem has been here for a while. Interestingly enough, from 1987 to 2008, 21 years, right, we had basically a drought. We had no rain event greater than a 25-year event. Then starting in 2008 and up until now, we get 100-year events, we had a 500-year event, a couple of 50-year events, and people are saying to me, hey, Mayor, I haven't flooded in 21 years. The city's sewers are broken. Something's wrong. And it's not to be trite, but it was the rain. It was just we had more rain. So I will look back. I'll reflect on that and the hard work that was done. Commitments that was made by the residents because someone has to pay for it. We got creative a little bit. There was a 1/4% sales tax, where about, I'd say 60% of the sales tax in Elmhurst are paid from people out of Elmhurst. They're helping pay for our stormwater, so that's getting a little creative. But really the stormwater is something that we had a pretty rough reputation there for a while as the town that flooded. And now, you'll never solve it, but we have more of a reputation, especially among our peers in DuPage County, as the town that addressed flooding. I'm in a group of DuPage mayors and managers. Sounds just what it is. 35 mayors and managers in DuPage County, and I would say we are probably 5 to 10 years ahead of everybody else in DuPage County and how they're handling stormwater. And we're constantly getting asked how we're doing it. So how we address stormwater is a big one, certainly a team effort. And then I'd say the other one is what I'll call controlled responsible development. You know, taxes are, and I don't want to call them an issue, taxes are a fact of life for everybody. And if you look at, I said we're a $120 million corporation basically. And our operating budget versus capital, our operating budget is somewhere between 60 and 70 million every year. Well, with inflation, you name it, could be anywhere from 1 to 2, 3%. That's $2 or $3 million every year. We got to figure out where it's coming from that we didn't need last year. And one of the best things you can do is broaden your tax base. We've tried to become developer friendly, but reasonably so. We do a lot of studies. We probably have done, I'm going to say, at least a dozen studies about demographics, development, the future. We rezoned our entire downtown about 2 years ago. We have a comprehensive plan. So we're constantly trying to understand the marketplace. Every study we do includes the public. We'll have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 meetings just about a public building we're going to build in town, or a park, or stormwater, you name it. So there's a lot of input, but ultimately, you know, I think Elmhurst has become an attractive town for developers, and I think it's really kind of a symbiotic relationship. So we've got a great downtown, but those mom and pop stores can't survive without density and without traffic. You know, I don't want to say I'm guilty of it, but my wife and I shop on Amazon probably every day. I would say that somewhere between half and 2/3 of the retail spend that comes out of my household personally probably comes from Amazon or somewhere online. Well, we better figure out how to make our downtown relevant and thrive and make it a destination. So just the morphing and the development of downtown during this changing economic market is something that has been fun. I'm proud of the fact that we've got a downtown where, I always say this to my wife, if you see an empty storefront, 9 times out of 10 it's under contract already. Between under contract and it's open, that depends on what's going in, whether it's a kitchen that has to rebuild, or sometimes it's a franchise and they have to meet certain parameters, or simple building code stuff that needs to be fixed. But even through this pandemic, Aaron Jason will tell you at City Hall, we have the lowest occupancy rate, or not occupancy rate, vacancy rate in our downtown that we've had in about 10 years. Right. So how we've shepherded through this and created kind of a destination for our town is another thing that I'll look back on.
Okay. We are talking with Mayor Steve Morley, getting some reflections from him as he starts his several-week journey into not being mayor. We'll be right back. The Community Bank of Elmhurst Business Zone has modern co-working space and a conference room free for our business customers. Visit the zone today at communityelmhurst.com. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender. Welcome back to Elmhurst, our community. We have the privilege today of talking to Mayor Steve Morley. And Steve, back in 2016, back in 2016, the Heritage Foundation and the Elmhurst History Museum put on an event where 4 mayors of Elmhurst, yourself, Mayor Levin, Mayor DeCiani, and Mayor Marcucci, got together to discuss, and I quote, the visions of the future of Elmhurst. All of the questions were posed from the perspective of, in 2036, which is the 200th anniversary of the founding of the city, what will things be like from the perspective of 4 leaders of our city? And I recently rewatched
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know what I said. I hope it was...
I rewatched it, and there were some themes and there's some things. So I'm just going to take these one at a time and just get your reactions. So on the economy, Elmhurst is in good shape, and the expectation is it will stay that way.
Okay.
So what?
I agree.
You feel the same way?
So, I will say this, and that's an interesting statement on the heels of 2020
Sure.
and the COVID pandemic. When I first came into office, it was 2007, 8, 9. And if you recall, the economy was having a pretty rough time. And we were looking at our general fund, and the good news is Tom Marcucci had been there before. In terms of the city finances being a little stressed or strained. So we jumped in. When I jumped in 2007, 2008, we had a general fund balance that was at about, I'm going to say, 6 or 7 million. And within 2 years, it was headed below 4. And if we had kept up our spend, we would have been out of money in about a year and a half. And, well, certainly that wasn't acceptable. So we looked at a whole bunch of things, including new sources of revenue, cutting services, cutting spending, you name it. And at the time, for almost my entire tenure as an elected official, Kevin York, who was one of the folks I mentioned earlier who had retired, Kevin York was the chairman of our finance committee. And he worked with Marilyn Gaston and Tom Trezine. And Kevin was kind of a rainy day type of guy. He was very conservative financially. So whenever budget season rolled around, Kevin always wanted to put more money in the bank. And he would press that. It was a constant theme. And it got to the point where, it's kind of that buzzing you hear in the background, but you don't really pay attention to it. But because of that attitude, Elmhurst went from being in a challenging financial position in 2007 to a fantastic financial position, and we still are. We came through this pandemic, we probably had, depending on the numbers, anywhere from a $5 to $8 million shortfall. Just funds that weren't coming in for whatever reason, whether it was sales tax or grants or you name it. The whole world had to figure out what they were doing during the pandemic. One of the things we did was the biggest rubber band, I call it the rubber band in our budget, is our streets paving. We've got 100 miles of road or streets. They're on about a 20-year cycle. So every year, if you do the math, you're supposed to do 5 miles to keep up and make it safe, and so you don't fall behind 5 years from now. All of a sudden, you have 17 miles to pave. So we had been doing that for the past 10, 15 years. We've been doing anywhere from 3 to 8 miles, depending. And in 2020, I think we were scheduled to do 7 miles, spend maybe $5 million. But as I said, that's our biggest rubber band in the budget. So early on, and this happened right before construction season was going to start, March, April. We had kind of put it to the city manager and staff early, right after this pandemic, and we're all closing down. We're like, hey, things are going to change. We better look at what we planned for this year and maybe make some adjustments. So we ended up canceling our paving contract. To give you an idea of like the ripple effect. So that poor contractor, it was part of the contract, there was a go, no-go date. It's not like we had committed and then yanked the rug out, but there was a go, no-go date, and we elected not to move forward. And that saved us $5 million, give or take. We had to put more money into patching and maintenance because we want our streets to be safe. And then the government, federal government, came through with some CARES Act funding, which ultimately was shepherded through DuPage County. But we qualified for almost $5 million in funding, but everybody in DuPage County qualified for a lot of money. We ended up getting about half, $2.4 million in CARES Act funding, and it really helped cover the gap between tightening our belt. You know, we're a staff of 300. Every year, either people move on to other jobs or retire. So we have in the neighborhood of 20, maybe a little more than that, vacant or dark positions that we elected to put a hiring freeze on. So it's not that we've eliminated the positions. In fact, we're reviewing that right now at City Hall. Is there anything through technology or efficiencies that maybe we can eliminate a position? But they're not eliminated yet. But through dark positions, tightening our belt on spend, and the CARES Act funding that we got from the federal government, to your question, we're in fantastic financial shape and ended the year with $16 million in our checking account, which is, per our policy, the limit. That's as high as we want to keep in there.
Okay, 2016. Ethnic diversity will increase within the community because we are a part of Metro Chicago. Seems pretty straightforward. Do you see that happening?
I do. You know, I'm definitely a free market kind of guy. I've always found, of course, I live here, but if you bump into somebody who is new to Elmhurst, well, it's one of two things. Either they married someone who grew up in Elmhurst, that's kind of the running joke. Half of Elmhurst knows what I'm talking about. But if you bump into someone else who's not from Elmhurst, they talk about some anecdotal incident that happened to them. They came here for a cousin's party, or they came here for lunch or dinner, or they were looking for a place to meet and this happened to be in the middle. And they always talk about not only how appealing Elmhurst was, but how friendly the people are. And I think that's the best thing we can do in that situation. I know that over this last summer, there was discussions about diversity in Elmhurst. And if you look at, again, I'll go with free market, you look at what has happened over the past 10 years, there's been an increase in diversity just by sake of where we are. But I also think it goes to the point I was trying to make, which is I think Elmhurst is a very welcoming and open community. And you know, if we can trap anybody in our net who comes in, I think they want to stay. So
We already touched on this, or you touched on this. Stormwater issues will certainly be mitigated to some extent by then, 2036, due to partnerships, good planning, and ongoing attention. So you've already spoken to that. The reputation of the city goes from a city that floods to a city that fixed flooding. You can't do it much better than that outcome, it seems to me. This one you'll like.
Uh-oh.
State of Illinois financial issues affecting the city is a serious issue and one that will be ongoing because of the threat of reduced revenues and unfunded mandates.
Yeah. Well, you might as well, you could have asked me in the same question, what am I not going to miss about politics? We're in a challenging state. I think that sometimes Elmhurst gets penalized for running so well. You know, people will point and say, well, look, you have money in the bank. You've done this, you've done that. Well, part of that is because of good planning. Yes, I think that the municipal relationship with Springfield and state is going to continue to be challenging. It's something that has been one of the most enjoyable things I've done as mayor, is be a member of this group, DuPage Mayors and Managers. I was chairman of the legislative committee for a couple of years. I was vice chairman, then I was chairman of the legislative committee for at least 4 years. And that meant that I talked to all of our state representatives and state senators and made multiple trips down to Springfield. And I would say the majority of that effort was to retain our independence and keep the money that was promised to us, if you will, by the state legislature back in the 70s, where there was an agreement made between the towns in Illinois and the state government of whether or not we would collect income tax. Well, we don't, right? The municipal, there's not an Elmhurst income tax. It's not an Oak Brook income tax, but there's a state income tax. And the agreement was, okay, you can collect an income tax from the state, but the state is obligated to bring some of that back to us. Over the past, I'd say 5 years, as the state's gotten in worse financial shape, they've started to tweak that agreement a little bit and not to our favor. So the financial issues of Elmhurst as it relates to state government are still there. Unfunded mandates, I'm sorry to say, are still a big issue. So an unfunded mandate, for those who don't know, is when somebody passes a law in Springfield and says, you must do this now. And then they put that requirement, that law, on the backs of the municipality, but they don't provide funding. So let's just hypothetically say, well, I have to say hypothetically, just recently, about a month ago, the state of Illinois said that in X amount of time, you're going to have to put cameras on all of your police officers. Okay? Whether or not you disagree with that, the fact of the matter is that is an unfunded mandate. That is a requirement that is going to be very, very expensive, and the municipality, in this case Elmhurst, is going to be forced to pay for that. And what's interesting is because of COVID, our legislature didn't meet. They had calls and they had other stuff, but they didn't meet in person and do any votes. And then they came together about a month ago for 3.5 days. And they issued a bill, this crime bill, which had great ideas in it, in my opinion, but should have gone through the legislative process, which means it goes through the House, it goes through the Senate, it has multiple committee meetings, there's negotiation back and forth. The people who are impacted, the police unions, the individual police departments, the municipalities, you name it, the people who are involved get to testify, get to participate, are really a resource for information so that you don't pass a crappy law. Susan Rose, I mentioned her before, used to say, rushed policy is bad policy. So back to this crime bill that they got pushed through. It was over 700 pages. Got pushed through in about 3 days. The day it actually passed, there was an amendment made of several hundred pages at 11 in the morning. That's Springfield politics. That disappointed me. I'm not being critical of the bill. In fact, I wrote letters and made phone calls to my legislators saying, hey, I think the ideas have merit. I think they're good ideas. But the process is flawed. Don't do this to us. That's Springfield. There's a perfect example of an unfunded mandate that's a good idea, but it got jammed through without much input from the municipalities.
So you just alluded to COVID. Obviously, the last year and a half of your term as mayor has been dominated by a global pandemic and a local pandemic in every sense of the word. How has that been for you? You alluded earlier that 2020 being mayor was your full-time job, and I know COVID had to be a huge portion of that, all of the, not just the disease, but all the other things. How's that been?
It's been challenging, Ken. I mean, if I had to put a silver lining to it or try to come up with a silver lining, is kind of historic, a unique situation for me in the executive position that I'm in, executive office, to be here while this was happening. You know, I wish it had never happened, but you know, didn't have much control over it. City manager and I don't want to say made it up as we went. We did so much research, so much digging to figure out what's next, what to do. I mean, the city of Elmhurst never closed. You know, we're kind of in the same sense. You know, as hospitals and other places that have critical functions, you can't close. We couldn't close the city of Elmhurst. We closed City Hall for a short amount of time, but we never stopped delivering our resources. We had to really rethink everything we were doing. On top of that, we knew we were going to do it with less money. Then we had federal and state laws that were being passed and come down to us, and they were happening so fast that, and even the federal and state lawmakers who were doing it and pushing it down to us at our level were telling us, you're going to have to figure out what this means. So that was a real challenge. One of the things that was very kind of a heady thing for me was early on, the Elmhurst City Council voted to give me executive authority as it related to COVID and COVID emergencies. So basically what that means is I could write legislation with the stroke of a pen, which was something I took very serious, quite daunting, but it was really in reaction to state and federal laws that might come down. So there was stuff like, at one point we were looking into doing like daycare for hospital workers. And we needed to open up a new place, potentially for hospital workers who were working 2 or 3 shifts in a row. And it's possible that those hospital workers' families, their primary daycare was closing down. So I had to, say, hey, it's okay. We're going to set up a temporary daycare at Timothy Christian, of all places. They volunteered and wanted to help. Other things in terms of federal law, how the Families First COVID Relief Act affected our various employees and our unions. There's certain things that's one of those examples where federal government created a law and sent it down to us, and I had to tweak it and figure out how it was going to shoehorn into Elmhurst. So COVID was like nothing we'd ever seen. I mean, even Dave Oberg, he's the head of our history museum. I remember him standing in my office as I'm signing my first executive order as mayor, and he's taking a picture of it. So, I mean, just these strange situations you find yourself in. I mean, putting up plexiglass everywhere in City Hall. I remember walking into City Hall and I said to Jim Grabowski, hey, somebody here just tested positive for COVID. And he said, what? Who? What? I said, yeah, we're going to have to answer that question. And that was in March when we were having those conversations. Sure. And sure enough, like a week and a half, 2 weeks later, someone who worked in our front office had a mother who got it, and they were living at home, so they didn't get it. And we're trying to run through these scenarios of, well, if she has it, what's the exposure? And we're talking to Pam Dunley and Lou Mastro at the hospital. What does this mean? And we're talking to Karen Ayala at DuPage County Health, Chairman Cronin. Hey, how do we handle this? And it was a lot of sharing. It was a lot of heads getting together and trying to do what's best. And it was a lot of work. And I'm glad, around Christmas time, we started seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. I had a meeting with the folks at Elmhurst Hospital, and they kind of said, hey, there's going to be a vaccine. I'm like, yeah. They're like, no, in 2 weeks, we're getting it. And you see that now. I think was it the state of Illinois or maybe DuPage County is close to 10% vaccinated right now. Now, we're not out of the woods, but I think it's giving some people some hope. But it's been a real challenge, Ken.
At every level of government, it appears to me anyway, the challenges of political issues, economic issues, socioeconomic issues at every level of government are sort of right in the face of any elected official anywhere. But at the local level, you're just as likely to run into a constituent in the Jewel as you are at City Hall. What is that dynamic like as it relates to being a leader in the community and interacting with the people you're the elected leader of?
That's a fun one. It really is. You have to, as an elected official, you have to embrace it a little bit. What a lot of people don't understand, at least in my opinion, is we have state senators, we have federal, representatives, state representatives, county board members, you name it, right?
Townships.
Yeah. But at the local level, so many people know who the mayor is. I'll walk downtown with a state senator or somebody, and they don't know who that person is. Nothing against them. I'm just saying It's a unique dynamic to your question. So when I first became mayor, I I never tell anybody, you know this, I don't tell people I'm the mayor, right? I just don't. I introduce myself as Steve and chit-chat, and if they figure out I'm the mayor at some point during dinner, whether they're waiting on me or something, they'll ask me a question. Oh, it's nice to meet you. Why didn't you say anything? And I didn't want to be that kind of guy. I just didn't. But I tell you what, if you look at the chart, the last 8 years of who knows your mayor, I mean, it's at about as high as it's going to get. And, with my family, they're very patient. And it's what I signed up for. It's what I actually ran for. And so I don't shrink away from it. But everywhere I go, certainly every time I go to the grocery store, and I mean every time I go to the grocery store, sure. Every time I go out to eat, somebody stops by and says hello, somebody has a question, and I love it. I really do. I mean, it's part of the job that I love. I'm interacting with these people. But in my family, it's a bit of a running joke. We used to say, to the kids or my wife, do you want to go out to eat? Well, are we going in country or out of country is what they would say. That means, are we going to Lombard or Oak Brook to have dinner, or are we going to Elmhurst?
Yes.
And I'll never forget, I was talking to my youngest daughter, who is now, she wasn't even in high school at the time, and now she's a sophomore at Clemson University. I said, hey, honey, come on, let's go out. Mom's busy. She had a meeting or something. I said, let's go out to dinner. She's like, where are we going? And I mentioned a restaurant in Elmhurst. I said, it's okay. I won't know anybody. She said, you'll know anybody, and that's not funny. So it's just, I see how it impacted my kids a little bit. But it's something I enjoy. Kind of an interesting twist over the last year, putting a mask back on has added to the anonymity a little bit. So it's unique. I embraced it. I didn't shy away from it. Like I said, I don't announce to people that I'm the mayor. But if somebody stops me, I'll never forget, I was having a drink at a bar. This is probably about 3 years ago. And I was watching the Hawks game, and I was with a couple of friends of mine. And about the 9th person showed up to say hello and ask me a question. And I wasn't watching the game at this point. I'm just talking to this person. And the other person, who happened to be an alderman, kind of leaned over the table and said, hey, he's here to watch the game. And I'm like, no, it's okay. So it's just a different dynamic in life. Hopefully that'll go down a little bit in 11 weeks, but who's counting? But it's been really enjoyable, and it's not something that I ever found a burden. I enjoyed it when the residents approached me, because that's what the mayor's for.
I was going to ask you what you were going to miss the most, but now I'm going to ask you what you're going to miss the least.
What am I going to miss the least? I tell you what, it's almost coming in 14 years ago to now. The thing that is probably the most challenging for elected officials, and I'll speak for the residents for the elected officials in Elmhurst, is there's not 2 sides to every story. There's 10 sides to every story. Whether it's a sidewalk or removing a tree or putting up a building or God knows what, water rates, taxes, you name it. Social media is pretty horrible when it comes to conveying information. There's a lot of people who go to social media to kind of validate or find the one piece of information they're looking for, but maybe not the whole picture. So I joke that if somebody posts something on Facebook or wherever, Twitter, the first person says, okay, this happened at City Hall. And the second person comments about what happened at City Hall, and the third person comments about what happened at City Hall, and the fourth person starts with, I heard, blah, blah, blah. And then the next 27 posts are, I heard, and it's based on a piece of misinformation. So I'm always telling people, go on our city website, contact your alderman or your local representative. If you want to know the real story, ask. Don't necessarily believe everything you read, and I always defend the newspapers. We'll have a meeting that's 3 hours long, and the newspapers have to figure out how to put it in 5 paragraphs. Well, they're not going to get it all. You're not going to get, if you watch a 3-hour meeting, you're going to get more out of it. So I would say that's probably the most frustrating thing as an elected official is maybe dealing with folks who don't have the whole picture. It's our job to give it to them. But sometimes people come in because they've heard something or they've been given misinformation. And if you logically sit back and think about it, and that's the one thing that I'm always, I don't want to say defending, but if an alderman's getting a hard time from someone in the public, I sometimes remind people, look, there's 14 of us. If you include the treasurer and the clerk and myself, there's 17 of us. We live in town just like you. We take out our garbage, our kids go to school, we have jobs. If you go in with the attitude, I think they're doing the best they can, you're going to get a lot more out of it than I know you're doing it wrong and you have something, you know, an axe to grind or something. And I haven't found that with all the elected officials I've dealt with in Elmhurst throughout the last 14 years, aldermen in the past, current ones, you name it. They're all trying their best for their community. And that's what's great about local politics. You know, if our senator in the state of Illinois lives in DeKalb, or you know, downtown Chicago in terms of our state, in terms of our congressman. No offense to him, but it's not personal, and local politics is personal. So that's kind of the part that I won't miss, is the miscommunication.
What would you ever consider public office again?
You know, that's an interesting question. So during the 14 years that I have been an elected official in Elmhurst, I've been approached, I would say, probably a half a dozen times. Pretty serious. Usually organizations or people, a group of people, have asked me to run for state representative, state senator, and county board. In fact, before I ran for alderman, Pete DeCiani asked me to run for school board. And I said, well, I'm going to have kids in school. I can't screw that up. So I made the wise choice and go into city politics. But I've been asked at that level. It comes up, you know, during election season. And I was always happy with what I was doing. Part of the reason I always told my wife when I got into this, she knew how much I loved it. I made a promise to her and my family I would not go down to Springfield. I called it going down to Springfield while my kids were in high school because I wanted to be there. And if there was any challenges or issues, and I had heard from senators and representatives who were in Springfield who had challenges with their kids back at home. So I didn't want to do that. So I always had that out in my mind that, okay, I'm not going to do it. I made a promise to my family and I kept the promise. And I was never truly tempted. It was always flattering when someone came up and said, hey, we really think you'd be good. But 14 years is a long time. So I'm going to take a break, Ken, at this point. Who knows? Ask me the question in 2 years. We'll see how I'm doing. But right now, I'm pretty happy to put the political career at least on hold.
So, although you're going to have multiple opportunities over the next several weeks to do this in various platforms, I wanted to give you an opportunity to look at the camera and share what you would like to share as you end your term, end your terms as mayor, to the citizens of town that may be watching.
Okay. You know, I don't like to talk necessarily. It's easier to talk this way than this way. But if in addressing the residents of Elmhurst, I guess the first thing I would say is thank you. It's really, if you look at my, we do these front porches quarterly. We send out these newsletters. And I have a letter to the residents in there every quarter. And I sign off by saying, I'm humbled and honored to be your mayor. And it's true, it's my hometown. It's been one of the great pleasures of my life to work in a town that I love for the residents that I love. So I can't thank you all enough for giving me this opportunity. It's been a wonderful ride. And then what I would say is it's been terribly rewarding. If you're watching this and you're wondering, hey, maybe I should, or if you're one of those folks who either at the cocktail party or at the bar says, hey, you know what we ought to do in this town, or you know what they should do, or there's something else I don't like, get involved. We have so many ways to get involved. We have a school district, we have a park district, there's 14 boards and commissions with 150 volunteers in the city of Elmhurst alone, not to mention the elected officials. So if you want to get involved, please do. If you're looking for that extra push, consider this that extra push, and you won't regret it. It's incredibly rewarding, and you get to see the fruits of your own labor. So I guess that's what I would say, and thank you again for a wonderful 14 years.
Well, thank you, Steve, and I can speak as a citizen of Elmhurst and certainly for Elmhurst, our community. Very, very appreciative of your work and your dedication and your passion for your hometown and your overall service, and wish you nothing but good luck and success going forward.
Thanks, Ken.
So, this has been Elmhurst, our community. We've had an opportunity to chat with Mayor Steve Morley just in advance of an April election that will bring us a new mayor, and we'll see who that turns out to be. But in the meantime, I'm Ken Bartels, Elmhurst, our community, and we'll see you again. The Community Bank of Elmhurst Business Zone has modern co-working space and a conference room free for our business customers. Visit the zone today at communityelmhurst.com. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.